Last Monday, the Supreme Court decided to do nothing about baseball. No comment, no explanation, just silence. And that silence made the sport less competitive, less accountable, and more protected than it was just 1 week before. Doing nothing was the whole point. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you watched a baseball game, a major league game, a full game, not in the playoffs, but just a regular season game from start to finish, and genuinely believed that your team had a real shot? Not hoped, not wished, but believed. If you're a fan in Los Angeles or New York or Toronto or any one of the cities that have one of the top 8 or 9 teams, that question is easy. But if you're in Miami or Oakland, Chicago South Side, or Anaheim, and yes, Anaheim counts, I want you to sit with that question for just a second. Because the answer isn't about your team's roster. It isn't about the manager or the front office or a bad draft class. The answer is structural. The answer is legal. And last Monday morning, it got worse. I want to tell you about a retired pitcher sitting on his couch with a sore arm in Montana in the 1970s. And I want to tell you about a team in Puerto Rico, a storied Caribbean team with a great history. And I want to tell you about the owner of the Los Angeles Angels, who recently said that winning isn't in the top 5 priorities of his fans. And I want to tell you why all 3 of those are the same story. In December 1975, an arbitrator named Peter Seitz ruled that baseball's reserve clause, the contractual mechanism that bound players to their teams indefinitely, with no ability to leave, no ability to renegotiate, and no ability to sell their labor to anyone else, was dead. The owners who had just hired him fired him that very day. There were 2 players at the center of that ruling. Andy Messersmith was one of them. He had just had arguably the best season of his career, and indeed of most anyone's career. 19 wins for the Dodgers, led the National League in innings pitched, complete games, and shutouts, was 5th in Cy Young voting, and an All-Star. He was considered by some the best pitcher in the National League, and definitely the most durable. And he had no say in where he worked and played. The other player was Dave McNally. McNally had just retired, sitting home in Billings, Montana, with a sore arm and was done with baseball. Marvin Miller, the shrewdest labor mind the game has ever seen, put McNally's name on a grievance alongside Messersmith's as insurance, because he knew that the owners would likely try to buy Messersmith off, offer him a contract big enough, and the grievance would die. Miller needed someone who could not be bought. McNally fit that bill. The owners came to McNally with a $150,000 contract and a plane ticket to spring training. He said no. He said his criticism was for the younger players who didn't have control over their own destinies. He never played another game. He never earned another dollar as a free agent. He just held the line and went home. The owners lost in arbitration, and then they went to court. And they lost there too. And here's the part of the story that almost nobody tells. They decided to not appeal to the Supreme Court. It was on purpose, because they had something more valuable than winning that labor fight. They had a 100-year-old antitrust exemption that covered everything. And they decided that exemption was worth more than the reserve clause by itself. They traded one to protect the other. They understood what they had. They have always understood what they had. Here's what that exemption is and why it matters, and frankly, how it relates to Major League Baseball today and many other closed systems that we talk about. In 1922, Supreme Court Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes ruled that baseball was not subject to federal antitrust law because it didn't constitute interstate commerce, teams crossing state lines to make money. But he ruled that's not interstate commerce. The reasoning was immediately questionable. It has been called by the Supreme Court itself as unrealistic, inconsistent, and an aberration. In 1972, the court upheld it anyway, admitted it was probably wrong, but said it was up to Congress to fix it. Congress waited 26 years. In 1998, they passed the Curt Flood Act, which removed the exemption for exactly one thing: player salaries. Everything else stayed. Franchise relocation, ownership decisions, the structure of the game itself. Congress looked directly at a 100-year-old legal mistake, admitted it was a mistake, fixed the smallest possible piece of it, and walked away. That was not neglect. That was a choice. The case they declined to even hear was about a team in Puerto Rico called the Cangrejeros de Santurce, the Crabbers of Santurce. Over 80 years old, 17 national championships. Roberto Clemente and Willie Mays even played on the same outfield on that team in 1954, well before they were ever stars. This is not a footnote franchise. In 2019, a man named Thomas Axon bought a controlling interest in the team. He won a championship. He brought in Daddy Yankee as a co-owner. He offered $2 million to renovate the stadium, a publicly owned facility with a broken scoreboard and no running water. The city rejected the proposal. Axon said publicly he'd move the team if the stadium wasn't fixed. The league president sent him a letter saying he'd engaged in conduct detrimental to baseball. The league didn't want him to move. The 5 other owners, each one a direct competitor with financial interest in seeing him gone and seeing Santurce stay where it was, voted to seize the franchise and sell it to someone else. Every court said federal antitrust law did not apply. But last Monday, the Supreme Court declined to look at why. Here's what's new about that. No federal court has ever before applied baseball's antitrust exemption to a league with no connection to Major League Baseball, ever. The exemption was created for Major League Baseball. Last Monday, it became something bigger. It now covers professional baseball as an activity, anywhere it's played in the United States, regardless of any relationship to the major leagues. The Major League Baseball antitrust exemption didn't just survive, it grew. And Major League Baseball wasn't even in the room in that conversation. Nobody called the commissioner. The architecture just covered them automatically. That is what a closed system looks like when it's working exactly as it is designed. It protects incumbents from competitive pressure without requiring anyone to do anything that looks like villainy. The system produced a victim without producing a villain. It almost always does. This December, the collective bargaining agreement between the owners and the union of Major League Baseball expires. The owners are expected to lock out the players. And the central fight, the one being framed as a competitive balance issue, is over a salary cap, the amount of money each team can spend. Here's what the argument is hiding. The teams pushing hardest for the salary cap are the same teams that have demonstrated for years that they won't spend to a floor, even without one. The Marlins have won 2 World Series and gutted the roster both times. The Athletics spent decades fielding non-competitive teams, extracted value from a publicly subsidized stadium in Oakland, and still moved the franchise with no penalty. The White Sox lost more games last season than any team in modern history of the sport while collecting revenue-sharing checks from the other owners. A salary cap doesn't fix this. The salary cap puts a ceiling on the Dodgers, the Mets, the Blue Jays, the Yankees. The gap between what small market owners spend and what they could spend is less visible. It doesn't make them spend more. It makes their non-spending harder to see. And this brings us to the Angels. Artie Moreno has owned the Angels since 2003. 1 playoff appearance in the last 11 years, and he cut $30 million from payroll this last offseason. He said publicly that winning is not in the top 5 priorities of his fans. He bought the franchise for $184 million. It's been recently appraised at $2.75 billion. There are no consequences for missing the playoffs for 11 years and then cutting payroll by $30 million, because the system he operates was designed to insulate him from consequences. No rival league can form to compete for his market. No team can move there without fellow owners' permission. The floor on franchise value has no ceiling on indifference. And what he was saying, without saying it, was that he can lose for 12 straight years, cut payroll by 30 million, and he still will be profitable. And I have a different take on this than a lot of people. A lot of people are trying to make Artie Moreno out to be the villain. We like to make the owners who don't spend so much money villains. But this is not Artie Moreno being a bad person. This is Artie Moreno being a rational actor in a system that has made failure profitable. The exemption is why that system works that way. And the Congrejeros decision just made that system stronger. The owners pushing for a salary cap know this. A cap is not a competitive balance measure, even though they say it is. It is a cost certainty measure that makes profitable non-competitiveness easier to justify and harder to see. Listen to that phrase, profitable non-competitiveness. It's a business decision. The small market owners do not want to spend more. They want the big market owners to spend less, so the distance between them is less embarrassing. That's a whole different thing. And the leverage in that negotiation just shifted quietly on a Monday morning when no one was watching. So where does that leave us? Congress won't fix this, not because they can't. They prove they can act when they choose to. But baseball exemptions don't move votes. And the owners have spent 50 years making sure that that stays true. But here's what the owners may be miscalculating. The threat of congressional action is not the same as congressional action. And that threat has been enough before. It shaped the 1976 collective bargaining agreement. It shaped the 1998 Curt Flood Act. Every significant moment of reform in this game's history came not from the courts and not from Congress. It came from enough pressure accumulating that someone decided getting ahead of it was smarter than waiting for it to arrive. The 2025 World Series was one of the most exciting in recent memory. Viewership across the board was up dramatically, helped greatly by a Canadian team participating and the Dodgers trio of Japanese stars. But domestically, just in the United States, last year's World Series drew about 16 million viewers, which was up about 2% from the year before. But compared to the viewership back in the 1990s, domestic American viewership of the World Series averaged between 25 and 40 million per series. Dave McNally turned down $150,000 and went back to Montana because he could see past his own immediate interest. He understood that protecting a bad system because it benefits you personally today is borrowing against a future you won't control. The owners don't have to be heroes. They just have to be smart enough to see what a retired pitcher in Montana saw 50 years ago. The exemption grew last Monday and nobody noticed, and the clock is running. My name's Tim. Thanks for watching.